without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Mike Seal so he can do the keynote presentation. And I'll let Mike kind of introduce the title for his talk.
Cool. Hi all. Okay, yeah. Bloody title, Professor. I'll talk about that in a bit. It's probably what I really see myself as is a youth worker, community activist. That's kind of what I've done most of my life. And somehow I ended up drifting into academia. I'm not quite sure how. And that's the context I now work in. I was just talking with people. I used to be a youth worker. Worked around homelessness just up in Everton and by Old Swan. And I was a youth worker at used to be the Brunswick Boys Club. I don't know if it's still called that, if in Bootle. So I used to be a detached worker working with the kind of Dockers kids. So around there, I did that. I suppose all I was really going to talk a little bit is about this activism, social justice and self-deception. For me, I suppose, academically, I mean, at BCU, I'm a professor of critical pedagogy, so it's all that Freirean education type stuff. That's kind of what I was schooled in, and it's kind of what I've tried to do within higher education, within universities. And I suppose the question I'm asking here is it possible, or is it just me self-deceiving myself? You know, because I work in it, I obviously probably invested in believing it's possible. But I'd leave that as an open question. Can we do that? Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about, for me and a group of people I work with, what maybe might make it possible to do critical pedagogy in higher education. So I'll remove that. This is the only theory you get, and it's got to do myself. And you get to a point where you quote yourself. Well, you probably can't see that. Like anything, the idea of what is critical pedagogy is pretty contested, you know, and it's funny, if you read a lot of the books, they don't really talk about it that much. So what I tried to do in that article was define it down a bit, really. And I suppose ultimately it's saying, for me, it's about community activism, really. I mean, if I look at those aims, which I can see that you can't, it's getting people to become aware of their own oppression. It's working with people. Although actually, I'll probably change my ideas. Actually, I think a lot of people, you know, when you're oppressed, you just go, what's the point? When I worked here in Liverpool in the kind of mid-90s, when we were talking with a few people about how the lack of monies there was at the time, I worked with a lot of people who knew this was being done to them, but they were like, what can I do with that? The other big thing is that your education needs to link to people's lived lives. And the other big push I have is that you want people to see themselves as knowledge producers, not just consumers. All that Mike Neary stuff about long since been colonised and regurgitated. But yeah, so for me, if I was to sum up critical pedagogy, it's doing that. And I was asking a colleague about how many of your students are from Liverpool. Now, there's a lot of what you mean from a place. It's quite contested, but often universities call it words like commuter students. It's really saying how many people actually live in the vicinity that are from around here. Most of the places I've ever worked in have been people from the local communities. Still racially diverse and all that kind of stuff, because most of the communities are, but they're kind of local. And that's where I think the potential personally for critical pedagogy in post-92 universities is huge, because the students we have are those people. Is that worked with? There's a little bit of context. I used to work at Newman University. People know that, in Birmingham, and I worked there for quite a long time. And I became a reader in critical pedagogy when I was there. And I remember the VC said, so what do you want to do now you've made your read? Because we're going to keep all your teaching exactly the same. We'll just give you some extra duties, because that's what you do with readers. Yeah. So I was like, well, what I really want to do is set up a critical pedagogy group, which is looking at that interface between, you know, communities, students. And he was going, oh, great. So it'd be like a discussion group and it's for academics. And I was like, no, it's for all staff and students and community. And we spent a long time making that happen, because you can't just say that will instantly happen, because it doesn't. But it took a long time to get to that. It eventually became an institute. But it wasn't a research institute. And if I'm honest, part of what it was doing was trying to erode or break down some of those barriers between teaching, research, you know, civic engagement, because I'm not sure they help. You know, for me, it's about breaking. And eventually, we wrote a book called Hopeful Pedagogies in Higher Education, I think it's called, which is collectively written between us. And what I quite liked about it is we had only 1 or 2 chapters from community members, but a third of it was written by students. Another third was written by was professional staff, supporting professional staff, because they're a part of that process, probably more so. The group used to have a porter that came to it, and I was always trying to get him to write. But he never did. He just never quite got the confidence to do it, which is a shame, because in terms of insight about what's really going on in the university, he absolutely knew. The same as if you want to know what's really going on, talk to the cleaners, talk to the catering staff, because they have different relationships with people. Never quite. But part of the model is we got people within that group. They wrote chapters, but then we sent it out to other people to get comments. So it was a model where we got comments, and then that became part of the chapter. It's the idea of having a dialogue. And it was quite interesting, because we sent it out to some of the names, I suppose, in critical pedagogy. And most of them were either on the point of or just retired. And there's nothing wrong with that. As somebody who's going to try and retire whenever I get the chance myself, it's becoming more pertinent. But there was this phenomena almost of what somebody else called radical retired. So you get more radical when you're retired because you've got less to lose, you know, which I can understand. But most of them came back and said, those days are gone, you can't do critical pedagogy in higher education. You can't do it. You can't have that meaningful engagement. And so a lot of the preface that I ended up writing was saying, really? Can't we? And so, and again, but what I also accept is this might be a self-deception, because I am still in higher education there. And maybe when I retire in 5 years, I'll be saying the same. I can't hope not. We'll see. Is it possible to do that different form of education? Read the book or anything. My ultimate conclusion is yes, just about. But you got to dance in the cracks. Yeah, so it's the cracks in between that happen in higher education that you can make some difference. And there's just about enough cracks. You know, because if you compare it to my colleagues, is anyone in ITE? So yeah, if you think about the curriculum that you've got and constricted by, and the pedagogies of sort of pseudo-psychological things that you're meant to impose upon people, my opinion. Not a lot of space. But if you work in schools, you know, you don't have any of this, hardly any freedom. I said to a colleague of mine who teaches in a school, how much per week do you reckon you could squeeze in just a bit of a different discussion that isn't being constricted? And he went, on a good week, about a quarter of an hour. I was like, what? But for me, I think it's possible, because we do still write on modules. I don't believe in modules, but we do. We do still look at assessments. There is potential to do something interesting there. Just. In theory, we have academic freedom. I'll just let that pause. Because the reality of that is more than contested. So I conclude it's vaguely possible. But what we did in that group is we said, what are the conditions that might make this possible to try and do critical pedagogy? Which is, teach a bit differently, engage with people, higher. And we came up with 10 points. And they're not, I wouldn't say they're scientific. They were meant to be probably provocations or just food for thought. So what I was going to do is just rattle through them, give a couple examples and get us talking about it, just as a way of getting us. So need to cultivate hope and articulate its importance to ourselves and others. It's funny, when people read Free Air, they often read the pedagogy of the oppressed. They don't read the later stuff, But if you look in the preface to the Pedagogy of Hope, he says, stop reading the early stuff. You don't believe that anymore. It was 20 years ago. And yet people often still do. Has anyone done that? I think the earliest piece I got published academically is about 20 years old. I read it now and go, well, I do things that I've did last year. That's part of the process, isn't it? Anyway, cultivate hope. And I suppose for me, the bit that I'd missed out on was the hope. And, I suppose, and a lot of the critiques of critical pedagogy, it's very good at analysing the social conditions for people, but does it leave people with any sense of hope about it? Because if you don't, people go, what's the point? I remember working with, the other thing I was proud about with that book is when I say the students wrote chapters, most of the students who wrote chapters weren't doctoral students, weren't master students. Half of them were foundation year students. Because often when we involve students, it can be particular groups. But I remember there was two young women there who working class Brummie background, and I will swear, but people are okay with a swear just because it's in context of what they actually said. So I remember they said, well, before I start this course, Mike, I kind of was always aware that I was probably a bit shafted. The system was against me. It was setting me up to fail. I was fine. And now you've shown me exactly how much, how far, how deep it goes, and how structural and endemic it is, and how it's set up against people like me. Was that meant to have helped? And I was like, it kind of brought me up short. I kind of went, you need to find some hope somewhere. Not a naive hope, but some hope that people can latch onto. Because otherwise they go, what's the point? So that's what made me think, spend time doing that. Okay. Seems to have moved. Boundaries. That's always an interesting word in higher education, maintaining boundaries. Have you ever been in that position where you're sitting there going, I don't believe in this assessment. You don't believe in this assessment. Nobody believes in this assessment. But you can't talk about it. Just as an example, whether that's something you should have for debate. Part of me saying is that you need to talk about what's going on, what power people have in the room that they might not know, what power you think you have or don't have. Because some of the structures we have can be in higher education are set up in a way that just re-inscribes certain things. Give an example. I remember speaking at a foundation year conference, used to foundation year network, And they got me to do the opening speech. And the thing I talked about there was, just looking at time. So, why do we lecture? We know it doesn't work. Standing up in front of people as a method of pedagogy, it's just total nonsense. And there's endless studies that show this. The lecture is the worst way of conveying things. So why do we still do it? And it was something because as soon as I said that, I just looked out and there was a big tumbleweed. And I went, I've not won this audience. And when I chatted to a few people afterwards, it was really interesting. They came up to me and went, I get what you're saying, Mike, but most of us in foundational and teaching and contracts, often fractional, often the lowest in terms of CPD and all that kind of stuff, it's set up against us. The only time I feel proper is when I'm giving a lecture. And I was like, okay. And then I talked to the students and they said similarly. I used to take them around the university and show them, where they might be taught. And you showed them the flipped learning classroom. And you got all excited about it. And they went, yeah, okay. And then you took them to the tiered sort of lecture hall. And they were like, oh. And they'd seen a lot of American movies. I think this is proper. But for me, I think it's discussing that. I think this is a statement. We need to have the right practice architectures. Part of what I'm involved in is setting up a kind of network of critical pedagogues in the UK. And part of that is what's been some of my motivation for engaging in. There have been those networks before, but we tried to look at why did they work and why didn't they. Quite a lot of them failed. Because often what they were lone academics who were the person within an institution who might have an interest in this, but it never broke that isolation. So to be a part of that network, what we said is, look, the way you've got to do it is you've got to have a group within the institution. And we'll be a network of that to support each other and make it. Because there'll be difficult times, particularly in the precarious environment we work in, there will be difficult times you have. So we need to have some way of supporting it. So that was one of our principles, keep that collective. And lots of other ones as well. But this is interesting. We're just talking about those pedagogic spaces. Some colleagues of mine are publishing a book at the moment about pedagogies of discomfort. For me, I don't like that word safe space because it's often safe for who. Actually, safe spaces aren't necessarily always pedagogic. And it was interesting, we did some stuff with students, and the frustration they often had is going, just when it was getting interesting, the lecturer closed it down in the name of safe space. Who wants to be safe? So it's just an interesting thing about those. Because when you feel alive, do you ever sort of lecture Friday afternoon, 3:45, you might have got the subject you didn't particularly want because you weren't there the day when they allocated your teachers. But you suddenly a moment happens and you go, this has got potential. It's what you do with it, isn't it? So yeah, there's a whole lot of discussion about what that means. Part of this, honour the indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing of people. But probably the best place to start is with yourself. I'll say the next one, the critical pedagogy network I ran at Newman had lots of people from early years. And all the early years, all the stuff they did was really interesting pedagogic stuff where it's all about play and got people to do this. But as soon as they became lecturers, they almost forgot that. And so they lectured in how to do play, rather than using play as a way of working with people. I remember saying, well, why did you do that? And they said, oh, it's kind of expected of me. I have to do these structures, don't I? And certainly on the ways of knowing of others, and try and build that in, which is complex and takes time. Okay. This was just something about we have more in common across each other. The critical pedagogy groups I set up, and I've set them up within Leeds. I'm trying to do one at BCU. I did one at Newman. What's been most interesting is when they've been right across the board, not just in terms of not just in terms of who, because it would be staff, support staff, students, community members, but also things like different disciplines. Yeah. Because you'll get things like going, you can't do critical pedagogy and maths and STEM subjects aren't political. As soon as you've got people from STEM subjects, they're going, of course it is. Of course it is. How you teach maths, how maths is understood. It's absolutely. It's just framing it. The one at Leeds Beckett who embraced critical pedagogy the most and done the most imaginative whole of their degree is raised around negotiated learning with students between each other. They set their learning objectives, they set assessments. Radical stuff I wouldn't even think about is in the tourism and leisure management. I was like, okay. But I think you do get this thing if you're educated. So it's most interesting to do that. Who do you, can you learn from? Okay, I'll rattle through the last. Yeah. Students are pedagogues, producers and partners. Just finding ways to put that in is the most interesting assessment I ever did on foundation years is people had to come up with their own theory. So rather than just learn a theory of yet another dead white man, let's get you to come up with a theory that explains. In terms of getting people to understand theory, it was fascinating, much better than giving a presentation. Quite a lot of them came out with conspiracy theories. And then we spent time going, why doesn't that add up? And the conclusion we came to is there probably are conspiracies. They're just not the ones we know about. By nature. Yeah. But you know, people have all kinds of stuff. One young woman, and I can't write things she said, and you said, Mike, you said, what we've got to do is look at what's already been done before just to make sure we're kind of coming up with it. And she had a really specific, fascinating stuff looking at the intersections between personality disorder she had and post-traumatic stress disorder and how that was diagnosed. And I was like, and I looked at it and said, well, the reason we haven't is that no one's thought of it. She was going, oh, so it's wrong then. No. Got some original thinking. Foundation. Yeah. Fascinating what people can do given a chance. She's now, hopefully, going to be starting her doctorate on that topic as she carried it through. So, last few. I'll rattle through these. Being student and staff-centred are colonised. They're not recognised. Good ideas will get colonised and recolonised and shift. I was talking to Mike Neary about, people know Mike Neary, like the work he did around producing and consuming. And it's just when I set up the foundation year and then slowly attrition had taken away all the interesting things. I was like, how did you cope with that? And he went, of course it's going to happen. You know, the structure's powerful. You know, what you do will have its time, and it might give hope to some of it will get recolonised and diluted and things. And don't worry about that. Same as those terms. Here's just one that I always tell myself, but I'm often don't do. you read from the big thing it says is they'll get you conflicts. They'll give you conflicts, but don't invest in them because they're not going to. And the big thing, internal conflicts. Are there any here? Does your bureaucracy not always work? Do you not always feel honoured? All of those things, You might say that they're really important to work on this, but if it consumes you, it just means you'll never go anywhere. I think that's something else. We can work within educational structures, but you need to push them, highlight their absurdity. I am a professor in critical pedagogy, and the nature of critical pedagogy is also saying we shouldn't have hierarchies of knowledge. And we are all college students. The idea of experts is set by experts. How much more could a professor be than that? So, since I've become a professor, I spend quite a lot of time undermining what I think that is. Because you should. But I've got the privilege in multiple ways to allow myself to be vulnerable to do that. Whereas I appreciate a lot of people don't. Oh no. Okay. I know the ones at BCU, I can tell them later. But,
It was from Lou, yeah.
I think it's a shame. And here's the last one, which is probably how it most relates to what we do here, is we need to re-articulate and continually re-articulate what we do and the institution about things like social justice, community action. Every mission statement of every university it's written right through, isn't it? Does it mean anything? Who knows? But yeah, there's a lot of stuff about being anchor institutions and civic institutions and stuff. But what it made me think is I have to engage with those debates. Because the easiest thing, a lot of what critical pedagogues do, or educators, they find a corridor you can hide in. Often sometimes in a literal corridor. But if we just hang here, they won't notice us. We'll just keep doing the things we do and it'll be fine. And I think that works really well, right up until when the expectations shift and change and the eye of Mordor suddenly turns towards that corridor. And unless we're embedded in some of those wider structures, you know what happens. So, okay. Got about 10 minutes. Do you want to talk to each other for a bit? I've chucked a whole lot at you, but do you want to talk on your tables for a couple of minutes and then just